Iran has a new supreme leader, the most powerful position in the Islamic Republic, commander of the armed forces, final authority over war, peace, and the nuclear program. The man who holds that office has not been seen in public since the moment he was appointed. He has not spoken, he has not given a speech, he has not appeared on camera. And according to Iran's own ambassador to Cyprus, there's a specific reason for that. He cannot. He was in the same airstrike that killed his father. And he came out of it with a fractured foot, a bruise around his left eye, and lacerations to his face. That is not a rumor. That is not an opposition claim. Iran's own ambassador, the Islamic Republic's official diplomatic representative to Cyprus, told the Guardian newspaper directly that Mojtaba Khamenei was injured in the same airstrike that killed his father, the late Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, along with 5 other members of the family. I don't think he is comfortable in any condition to give a speech, Ambassador Alireza Salarian told the Guardian. That is a sentence worth reading twice. Iran's ambassador, speaking on behalf of the government, explaining why the Supreme Leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the country currently in the middle of a war, cannot give a speech because he is injured. Because the first airstrike of Operation Epic Fury did not just kill the Supreme Leader, it also wounded his son and successor. The man now leading Iran walked into the highest office in the Islamic Republic with a fractured foot, a bruised eye, and cuts on his face. And for more than a week, Iranian state media has been filling the silence with footage of him that is not current. Some of it is archival. Some of it, according to CNN, is AI generated. That is the story of Day 13. And it starts with who Mojtaba Khamenei actually is, what the strike did to him, and what it means that the country currently fighting a war against the United States, and Israel is being led by a man who cannot yet stand comfortably in front of a camera. Let's begin with what we know from sourced reporting about the injuries themselves. A source familiar with the situation told CNN that Mojtaba Khamenei suffered a fractured foot and other minor injuries on the first day of the U.S. and Israeli bombardment campaign. In addition to the fractured foot, Khamenei, who is 56 years old, received a bruise around his left eye and minor lacerations to his face, that source said. An Israeli source separately told CNN that Khamenei was injured in what the Israeli source described as an assassination attempt in the opening strikes of the campaign. Iran's ambassador to Cyprus, Alireza Salarian, provided the Iranian government's own account to The Guardian. He said Khamenei was injured in the same airstrike that killed his father. The same airstrike, not a separate targeting operation. The opening strike that killed Ayatollah Ali Khamenei also wounded his son. 5 other members of the family were also killed in that same airstrike, Salarian said. Then Salarian added the line that explains Mojtaba's public silence. I don't think he is comfortable in any condition to give a speech. Now let's add what Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian's own son said about this. Yusuf Pezeshkian, the president's son, told the state-affiliated Iranian students' news agency, ISNA, that he had heard Mojtaba Khamenei was injured. He then added, "The new supreme leader is safe and there are no concerns." Safe and no concerns, but also unable, according to the ambassador, to give a speech. Both things are being communicated simultaneously by different parts of the Iranian government. And the result is a supreme leader who has been announced, celebrated with mass street rallies in Tehran, described by Russian President Vladimir Putin as the inheritor of his father's legacy, but who has not appeared once in any verified current footage since the day he was named. Now let's talk about what Iranian state media has been doing to fill that gap. Because CNN's reporting on this is specific and documented, Iranian state media and propaganda networks have made extensive use of the little archival footage that exists of Mojtaba Khamenei. When archival footage runs out, they have filled the gaps with AI-generated images, artificial intelligence, generating images of the new supreme leader to show to an Iranian public and a watching world, in place of current footage that does not exist because the man cannot yet appear publicly. This is confirmed in CNN's reporting, not alleged, not speculated, confirmed by CNN, and it reveals something important about the information environment inside Iran right now. The most powerful man in the country is absent. The state is generating synthetic images of him to project continuity. And Iran's own ambassador is explaining the absence by confirming the injury. All of that is happening simultaneously, while Iran is fighting a war, while its missile forces continue launching, while its foreign minister gives interviews and its generals issue statements. The figurehead at the top of the entire system, the supreme leader, is physically unable to appear. Let's talk about who Mojtaba Khamenei actually is, because CNN's reporting gives the clearest documented picture. He is 56 years old. He was born in relative obscurity, studied in the seminary city of Qom, and fought as a teenager in the Iran-Iraq War. When Iran's Assembly of Experts announced his appointment, state media released a 4-minute documentary recounting that biography. Modest origins, seminary studies, war service, and now his martyred father's throne. But what his public biography understates is his actual role in the system his father built. Mojtaba Khamenei kept a low profile for decades. He held no elected office. He was not a high-ranking cleric. But he was, according to CNN, a central figure in the vast network of influence that his father, Ali Khamenei, cultivated during his decades-long tenure as supreme leader. He had ties to the IRGC. He had ties to what CNN describes as the regime's economic elite. And as far back as 2021, photos circulated on social media showing Iranians distributing posters promoting him as the heir apparent to his father's position. This was not a surprise appointment. The architecture for it had been visible for years. The U.S. Treasury Department recognized it years before the war. In 2019, the U.S. Treasury sanctioned Mojtaba Khamenei specifically for allegedly working closely with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to advance what the Treasury described as his father's destabilizing regional ambitions and oppressive domestic objectives, sanctioned in 2019. Made supreme leader in 2026 after his father was killed in the opening strike of an American-Israeli military operation, and now leading the country from wherever he is recovering. With a fractured foot and lacerations to his face, the question of what his ascension to the leadership means strategically was addressed directly by Maha Yahya, director of the Beirut-based Carnegie Middle East Center. She told CNN that Mojtaba Khamenei's selection can be read as a deliberate message, a message from the Iranian regime to the United States and Israel. The message, military pressure, is not going to get us to shift position. Not going to get us to shift position. That is the framing of the Iranian leadership succession as an act of defiance, not capitulation. The U.S. and Israel killed the supreme leader. Iran named his son a hardliner, a man observers believe is, in CNN's words, just as, if not more, hardline as his father was. Someone with deep IRGC ties. Someone who was sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury for those very ties. And Trump called this selection unacceptable. He told CBS News he had no message for Iran's new supreme leader. He told reporters he has someone in mind to replace Khamenei, without elaborating. Unacceptable is the U.S. position on Iran's choice of who leads Iran. And Iran's choice walks with a fractured foot and cannot yet speak publicly. But the choice has been made, and the Iranian government is using AI-generated imagery to project the presence of a man who cannot yet project it himself. Now let's bring in the financial disclosure. That gave Day 13 a completely separate headline. Because Pentagon officials briefed a group of U.S. senators on Tuesday in a closed-door session. And what they disclosed about the cost of this war deserves its own chapter in this script. According to 3 people familiar with that briefing, who spoke to ABC News, the war in Iran cost at least $11.3 billion in its first 6 days. 6 days. $11.3 billion. The New York Times first reported that figure. Senators on the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee received the briefing. Senator Chris Coons, the top Democrat on that subcommittee, confirmed the number publicly. I expect that the current total operating number is significantly above that, Coons told reporters on Wednesday when asked whether the $11.3 billion figure accounted for military buildup costs. He then offered his own estimate for the daily rate. To assume that it is well above $1.5 billion a day, I think, would be a fair guess, Coons said. $1.5 billion per day on day 13 of the operation. Let that number sit for a moment. $11.3 billion in the first 6 days. More than $1.5 billion per day by Senator Coons' estimate. And here is the critical context that ABC News reported alongside those numbers. The money that has been spent so far comes out of Pentagon funds already allocated by Congress. Congress has not yet approved any additional funding for the Iran operation, and lawmakers on both sides of the aisle told ABC News that the White House has not yet made a formal request for supplemental funding. The most expensive American military operation in at least several years is being funded without a supplemental appropriations request, without a congressional vote on war funding. The 60-day clock under the War Powers Act started on February 28th. Congress has not voted to authorize the war. Congress has not been asked for additional money to pay for it. And the bill, according to the Pentagon's own closed-door briefing, is at minimum $11.3 billion, rising by well over $1 billion every day. Now let's look at what the government is doing about oil prices, because Tuesday brought the most dramatic oil supply intervention since the emergency reserve releases of 2022. The Department of Energy announced, confirmed by ABC News, that President Trump has authorized the release of 172 million barrels from the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, starting next week. The release will take approximately 120 days to deliver at the planned discharge rate, according to Energy Secretary Chris Wright's statement. And this is not a unilateral U.S. decision. The International Energy Agency announced a coordinated global release, 400 million barrels total, from emergency reserves held by IEA member countries around the world, 172 million from the U.S. alone, 400 million total from the international system. Trump explained his reasoning in an interview with Ohio CBS affiliate WKRC. Well, we'll do that, and then we'll fill it up. I filled it up once, and I'll fill it up again. But right now, we'll reduce it a little bit, and that brings the prices down, he said. The strategic reserve exists precisely for situations like this. A sudden large disruption to global oil supply caused by a major geopolitical event. 20% of the world's daily oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz. Commercial traffic has effectively stopped. G7 finance ministers are discussing the coordinated reserve release, 172 million barrels from the United States, 400 million total from the international system. This is the largest emergency oil reserve deployment being coordinated since the post-COVID supply disruptions. It is the direct economic consequence of a war that has effectively bottled up a fifth of the world's daily oil supply behind a waterway that Iran declared closed. Now let's talk about Trump's statements on day 13, because the pattern that defined day 11, simultaneous declarations of victory and announcements that the fight is still ongoing, continued on Wednesday. Speaking in Hebron, Kentucky, Trump said this: "We've won. Let me tell you, we've won. You know, you never like to say too early you won. We won. In the first hour it was over, but we won." Then he added, "We got to finish the job, right?" Won in the first hour and still has to finish the job. Trump also said on Wednesday that there is practically nothing left to target in Iran. Practically nothing left to target. That was followed immediately by an announcement that U.S.-Israeli operations would continue as long as necessary, according to Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz, cited in the ABC News live update. Nothing left to target. Operations continuing as long as necessary. Both of those statements were made on the same day. And on the school strike question, the girls' elementary school in Manab, southern Iran, Trump said on Wednesday that he doesn't know about reports that the Department of Defense's own preliminary assessment found the U.S. was likely at fault. "I don't know about that," Trump said, according to ABC News. A preliminary U.S. assessment, described to CBS News by a person briefed on the findings, concluded the U.S. was likely responsible for that strike, possibly due to outdated intelligence. Trump said he doesn't know about it. The investigation, he said on earlier occasions, is ongoing. And he said he would accept whatever the report shows. The report is not yet public. Let's go back to the man at the center of this script. Because the story of Mojtaba Khamenei's injuries and absence is not just a human interest sidebar, it is a strategic intelligence question. Here is what is verified. Mojtaba Khamenei was in the same strike that killed his father on day 1. He suffered a fractured foot, a bruise around his left eye, and lacerations to his face. He has not appeared publicly since being named supreme leader. Iran's own ambassador confirmed he cannot give a speech. Iranian state media is filling the void with archival footage and AI-generated images. Now here is what that situation means for understanding Iran's decision-making at this moment. The IRGC is still launching missiles. The foreign ministers still giving interviews. The president's office is still issuing statements. Iran's governmental machinery is still operating. But the constitutional authority at the top of all of it, the supreme leader who has final say over war, peace, negotiations, and nuclear decisions, is physically incapacitated. Who is making the strategic calls inside Iran right now? The sources in these documents do not answer that question directly. What they do confirm is that the answer is not Mojtaba Khamenei in a public, visible, functioning command capacity. He was sanctioned in 2019 for working closely with the IRGC. He has deep ties to the security establishment. It is reasonable to conclude, based on that background, that IRGC leadership is closely involved in the current decision-making. But that is analysis, not confirmation. What is confirmed is this: the supreme leader is injured, absent, and represented publicly by AI-generated images, and the war continues. Let's talk about what the 2009 protests tell us about Mojtaba Khamenei's relationship with the Iranian public. Because CNN's reporting includes a historical detail that gives necessary context to the current moment. When Iran's contested 2009 presidential election returned Mahmoud Ahmadinejad to a second term, mass protests erupted. The Green Movement, millions of Iranians in the streets. Among the protesters' targets was Mojtaba Khamenei. Many in the country believed he had a hand in the disputed election results. Before the uprising was crushed and Iran's domestic opposition was obliterated, protesters chanted a specific phrase in Farsi: Mojtaba bemiri rahbari ronabini. The translation: Mojtaba, may you die so you don't assume the leadership role. A chant. In the streets of Tehran, specifically about Mojtaba Khamenei, specifically about him never becoming supreme leader. 17 years later, he is the supreme leader. The opposition that chanted that phrase has been suppressed for years. The protesters who chanted it either fled the country, were imprisoned, or went silent. And the man they chanted against is now sitting in his father's seat, with a fractured foot, and lacerations to his face, represented on state television by AI-generated images, in the middle of a war against the United States and Israel. That is the specific historical weight Mojtaba Khamenei carries into the office he now holds. a figure who was sanctioned by the American Treasury, who was the target of mass protest chants in his own country, who watched his father lead Iran for decades from behind the scenes, and who entered the Supreme Leader's office having survived the same airstrike that killed his father. Now let's look at what the AI imagery specifically reveals about Iran's information strategy during this period. Because it is easy to dismiss AI-generated images of a political figure as a curiosity. It is not a curiosity. It is a deliberate state decision. Iranian state media made the choice to use AI-generated images of Mojtaba Khamenei rather than acknowledge his absence or explain his condition through official channels. The ambassador explained the condition to a foreign newspaper. State media generated synthetic imagery for domestic consumption. Those are two different communication strategies running simultaneously toward two different audiences. To the outside world, yes, he was injured, he cannot speak yet, he is safe. To the Iranian domestic audience, here is footage of your supreme leader, the footage that is generated by a computer. Why does this matter strategically? Because the supreme leader in the Iranian system is not just an administrative position, it is a religious and symbolic one. The supreme leader holds the concept of velayat-e-faqih, guardianship of the Islamic jurist. The supreme leader's authority derives partly from his religious legitimacy and his visible, active presence at the head of the Islamic Republic. An absent, injured, silent supreme leader whose image is being generated by artificial intelligence is a problem for a system that derives authority from that presence. The state knows this. That is why they are generating the images, not to deceive international intelligence services. Those services know exactly what is happening. To maintain the symbolic continuity of the office itself for a domestic audience that is already living through bombings, missile alerts, and an unprecedented military conflict. State media is managing the symbol, while the man behind it recovers from a fractured foot. Let's go back to the cost number. $11.3 billion in the first 6 days. More than $1.5 billion per day. Senator Coons said the current total is significantly above $11.3 billion by day 13, the day of this report. At a conservative estimate of $1.5 billion per day, the total cost of Operation Epic Fury has crossed $20 billion. That is not a precise figure. That is Senator Coons' daily estimate multiplied across 13 days, which gives an order of magnitude. The actual number is classified. But the senator described $11.3 billion as the 6-day figure and called $1.5 billion per day a fair guess for the ongoing rate. And no supplemental funding has been requested. And no congressional vote on war authorization has taken place. The War Powers Act clock is running. It started February 28th. It expires approximately April 28th. Congress has 60 days from the start of hostilities to either authorize the war or force its termination. The House Republican retreat where Trump spoke on day 11 received applause when he said the U.S. would not relent. But applause in a retreat setting and a formal authorization vote are two different things. And the bill is now, conservatively, above $20 billion, with no supplemental funding request from the White House, and no authorization vote from either chamber. The strategic petroleum reserve decision deserves one more look, because 172 million barrels sounds like an enormous number. It is. But context matters. According to independent research firm Rystad Energy, cited in CBS News reporting from earlier in the week, roughly 15 million barrels of crude oil flow through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. Commercial traffic has effectively stopped in the strait. If the strait remains effectively closed, the world is losing access to roughly 15 million barrels of daily supply. 172 million barrels from the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve covers approximately 11.5 days of that lost daily volume. The full IEA coordinated release of 400 million barrels covers approximately 26.5 days. That math tells you what the reserve release can do. It can smooth out the worst of the price spike for several weeks. It cannot replace the strait. Only reopening the strait, or establishing reliable military escorts through it, can address the underlying supply disruption. Trump said he is considering taking control of the strait. France announced a purely defensive mission to help reopen it. IRGC Brigadier General Jabari said Iran's forces are waiting in the strait for American warships with missiles not yet disclosed. The reserve release is the economic bridge. The strait question is the actual problem. And both sides are still positioned at the entrance. Let's close with the full picture of what Day 13 has confirmed. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, was injured on day 1 of this war in the same airstrike that killed his father. That is confirmed by Iran's own ambassador to Cyprus, by a source familiar with the situation who spoke to CNN, and by 2 Israeli sources who spoke to ABC News. He has a fractured foot, a bruise around his left eye, lacerations to his face. He cannot give a speech. He has not appeared in public since being appointed. Iranian state media is using archival footage and AI-generated images to fill the absence. The Iranian president's own son confirmed he heard about the injuries and called the new leader safe. The war that injured him on day 1 is now on day 13. It cost $11.3 billion in its first 6 days alone, according to a Pentagon briefing to U.S. senators. Senator Chris Coons, the top Democrat on the Senate Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, called that figure roughly accurate and said the current total is significantly above it. He estimated the daily cost at well above $1.5 billion. Congress has not approved supplemental funding. The White House has not requested it. To address surging oil prices that reached nearly $120 per barrel last week, the U.S. government is releasing 172 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The IEA is coordinating a total release of 400 million barrels globally. Trump says the U.S. has won. Trump also says it has to finish the job. Trump says there is practically nothing left to target. Israeli Defense Minister Katz says operations continue as long as necessary. Iran's IRGC Air Force commander announced days ago that, going forward, only missiles with warheads heavier than 1 ton will be launched, and frequency, power, and range will increase. Iran's IRGC said it was capable of continuing at least a 6-month intense war at the current pace. Senior IRGC General Jabari told the New Arab the force was prepared for a war lasting up to 10 years, the man at the top of Iran's command structure. The supreme leader whose authority over those military decisions is constitutionally absolute, is recovering from a fractured foot, and cannot yet give a speech, while his government generates AI images of him to fill the silence, while his ambassador explains his absence to a British newspaper, while his country's missiles continue to fly. That is the reality of day 13. The supreme leader is injured and silent. The AI images are running on state television. The bill is past $20 billion and rising. The oil reserve is being drained. The strait is still contested. And the war that started on February 28th is still going, with no authorization, no supplemental funding, and no end date confirmed by any verified source, only Trump saying he won, and saying he has to finish the job. At the same time, let's go deeper on what we actually know about how supreme leaders in the Iranian system exercise authority. Because Mojtaba Khamenei's physical condition is only half of the strategic picture. The other half is what happens to decision-making when the person holding that constitutional authority is absent. Under the Iranian constitution, the supreme leader holds the highest religious and political authority in the state. He is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He appoints the commanders of the IRGC, the regular military, and the police. He has final authority over declarations of war and the terms of any peace or ceasefire. He controls the nuclear file. His word is constitutionally final. That is the structure on paper. In practice, over the years of Ali Khamenei's rule, the IRGC developed into an institution with enormous independent operational capacity. It runs its own intelligence apparatus. It runs its own missile program. It runs its own drone manufacturing. And Mojtaba Khamenei, according to the 2019 U.S. Treasury sanctions designation, worked closely with the IRGC throughout the years he spent in his father's office building influence. His ties are with the IRGC command. So the question of who is directing Iran's military operations right now is less about a vacuum at the top and more about whether the existing institutional relationships between the Supreme Leader's office and the IRGC are holding. The evidence from the outside, continued missile launches, continued drone attacks, the IRGC Air Force commander making public announcements, suggests those institutional relationships are functioning, the operations are continuing, the commanders are speaking. The missiles are still flying. The fractured foot does not appear to have stopped the machine. But the constitutional legitimacy that provides the formal authorization for all of that, the Supreme Leader's signature on the decisions, is residing in a man who is recovering from injuries sustained on day 1, and who has not yet spoken publicly, and who is being represented by AI-generated imagery on state television. That gap between the formal authority and the operational reality is one the outside world cannot fully see into right now. And that gap may matter a great deal when the time comes to discuss terms. Because who speaks for Iran? The foreign minister is giving interviews. The president's office is issuing statements. IRGC generals are making declarations about 10-year wars and waiting for U.S. warships. But the person who, under the Constitution, has final authority over negotiating a ceasefire, accepting or rejecting terms, and making the strategic decision about when and how this war ends, he cannot yet give a speech. Let's look at the AI imagery question from a different angle, because the use of AI-generated images of Mojtaba Khamenei is remarkable not just as a media strategy, but as a technical admission. When a government resorts to generating synthetic images of its leader, it is making a calculation. The calculation is, the absence is more dangerous than the deception. If Iranian state media had simply not shown Mojtaba Khamenei, his absence would have been noted immediately by an Iranian public already living through bombing sirens and power outages. The question would have become the news. Where is the supreme leader? The AI images are an attempt to preempt that question. But the images themselves, once identified as AI-generated, and CNN's reporting identifies them as such, create a different and potentially more damaging question. Why is the government showing us fake images of our leader? That is a question with an answer that undermines the purpose of the images entirely. The attempt to project continuity exposes the discontinuity it was meant to conceal. This is not speculation. CNN reported the AI imagery as fact. The Iranian government's own ambassador then confirmed the injury to a British newspaper. The combination of those two facts, AI images plus a confirmed injured leader, means the Iranian public and the international community now both know that state television is generating synthetic images to cover a genuine absence. That is not a position of strength. But it is also not a position that stops missiles from launching. The IRGC does not need Mojtaba Khamenei to appear on camera to continue operations it was running before he was named supreme leader. Let's look at the historical precedent for an Iranian supreme leader disappearing from public view during a crisis, because this has happened before. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the founder of the Islamic Republic and the first supreme leader, spent significant periods of his later years largely withdrawn from public view due to illness. During those periods, the institutions he built, the IRGC, the revolutionary courts, the intelligence apparatus, continued to function. The Islamic Republic was designed to function even when the supreme leader is not present and active. That design is what Mojtaba Khamenei is now relying on. The system his father spent 32 years reinforcing. The institutions that are, at this moment, launching missiles and drones across the Gulf. While he recovers, while state television runs AI images in his name. While his ambassador confirms he cannot yet speak. There's one final thread to pull in this story. It is about who knew Mojtaba Khamenei was injured and when. An Israeli source had told CNN that Khamenei was injured in an assassination attempt last week, meaning within the first days of the war. Rumors of his injuries circulated for days before any government confirmation. Iranian state media denied or ignored those rumors during that period. State television ran archival footage, then AI-generated images. Then Iran's ambassador to Cyprus confirmed the injuries to The Guardian. Then the president's son confirmed to the Iranian Students News Agency that he had heard about the injuries. That sequence tells a specific story about information management. Israel knew. Israeli intelligence assessed it and communicated it. The rumors circulated. Iran denied or ignored them through state channels. Then the confirmation came through the ambassador, a diplomatic back channel to a foreign newspaper, rather than through official state media. And state media continued with AI images even as the ambassador was confirming the injuries to The Guardian. Two tracks of information, running simultaneously, telling different audiences different things. That is, the information architecture of a government managing a crisis it did not fully choose, and a leader whose condition it cannot fully control the narrative around. The fractured foot is healed or healing, the lacerations are fading. At some point, Mojtaba Khamenei will appear publicly. He will give a speech. He will assert the authority of his office. And when he does, every word he says will be measured against the days of silence and AI images that preceded it, against the ambassador's confirmation that he was in the same airstrike that killed his father, against the 2009 protest chant that said he should die before he could assume the leadership role, against Trump calling his selection unacceptable, against the U.S. Treasury sanction that said he worked with the IRGC to advance destabilizing regional ambitions. All of that context will be the backdrop to his first public appearance, and the world will be watching to see if what he says matches the continuity the AI images tried to project, or if the injuries left him in some way not yet visible changed. Day 13. The Supreme Leader is injured. The AI images are running. The missiles are still flying. The war is costing more than $1.5 billion every day, and nobody yet knows when the man who has constitutional authority to end it will be able to speak.